Everybody, welcome. This is going to be the third episode of me walking through kind of the history of the CIA and the intelligence agencies. Previously, I'm going to do a quick review of what we've talked about previously. Intelligence or espionage goes back quite some time. The original, relatively modern days goes back to Venice and the mercantile espionage. This is all for commercial purposes. When Venice was in the 11th, 12th, 13th century, they would send their spies into different cities they wanted to trade with. They'd find people that were amenable to, basically, make a little bag for themselves and selling out their country so Venice could get better trade deals. The British Empire really perfected it with their colonialism. What they did in India was just fascinating. They would send their spies. These are usually lawyers. This is private espionage, or to different countries they wanted to trade with, and to get they would pay bribes to get the right people on the throne or in positions of power so they'd get better trade deals. This is how the British built their empire. India is fascinating because this huge, massive country of India was basically being controlled by about 100,000 troops. 10,000 were British troops, and about 90,000 of them were British East India Company private troops. And that was done because of the intelligence work that was done. The United States, we were novices at intelligence. We just never participated in it until the 20th century. Just before the 20th century, we had secretaries of state, and we talked about this before, guys like Sherman and Lansing. They were sponsored by robber barons who wanted to control U.S. foreign policy. Our secretaries of state from the 1880s on were almost all connected to the elites, or one of these robber barons or ruling class families. I talked before about Sullivan and Cromwell. That's a law firm that did a lot of this work. They were the ones who annexed the Panama Canal from Colombia, or Panama from Colombia, so they could build a Panama Canal, basically to benefit the United Fruit Company and the DuPonts, and some of the other elite blue blood families. They did the same thing in Hawaii. They were the ones that did the espionage for the Spanish-American War. But again, that was a commercial war. It benefited commercial interests, not the United States of America. And then I talked to you another time about the Dulles brothers, Sullivan and Cromwell. We talked about Skull and Bones, which is the Yale secret society that the Bushes and a bunch of other people involved in. That's kind of like the people that were controlling American intelligence, but it was done on the private side, not the public. It wasn't the U.S. government wasn't directing these activities. These were private entities that were doing espionage and then influence American government. So our military would go to war and destabilize countries so that these people could get cheap labor and cheap resources. And that's been the American history since about the 1880s. It's not a pretty sight. These same people, the Bushes, Sullivan and Cromwell, that's a Wall Street law firm. Brown Brothers Harriman is a Wall Street private bank that did a lot of this stuff. We talked about that. They created the business plot. In 1933, they tried to overthrow FDR in a military coup where Major General Smedley Butler basically said no at the last minute, and then gave testimony in Congress that all of these bankers, oligarchs, private enterprises, multinational corporations, about 50 families from the Northeast of America, the Blue Bloods, tried to take over America. These are the same people that financed the Nazi Empire. The Dulles brothers, and the big part of this presentation tonight is going to be Alan Dulles. He's the star of the show tonight. But they were there at 1919 at the end of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles. John Foster Dulles was sitting on the Ally side, and Alan Dulles was actually representing the Germans. They carved out the future of Europe, which is a remarkable feat of dastardly doings. These same people tried to keep us out of World War II because they were financing the Nazis. They financed the Nazi regime all through the 30s. This happened. And they didn't want us to go to war. And finally, Pearl Harbor hit and we went to war. Then what happened is these people joined FDR's War Department, because once we went to war, they needed intelligence people. These are the lawyers who've been doing this stuff for decades, and we had to win a war. So that's kind of what we've talked about in the past. The last presentation I did was about the Bush and Clinton crime families, is what I called it. And I talked a little bit about Iran-Contra and how these old connections from decades before got us into the drugs for weapons, for political influence, and that was going on between Iran, South America. We're trying to overthrow different regimes down there. A lot of it for commercial purposes. Once again, all for profit. So that's kind of what we've talked about before. So I'm going to jump in here today, and I didn't know what to call this presentation. Is it going to be the history of American intelligence? Well, we talked about it a little bit, and we're going to go through some history of the U.S. intelligence agencies. I wanted to call it The Rise of the Fourth Reich, but somebody already wrote that book, and I don't want to plagiarize. Too much. It's a good book, by the way. And I'm trying to remember the name of the author, and I forgot it. But for tonight, we're going to call it Alan Dulles' CIA and its rogue foreign policy. The history of the United States intelligence, private intelligence only. Formerly, we had private intelligence. When war started, we did pretty good in intel, but we always dropped the ball in between the wars. We didn't have foreign entanglements up until the 20th century. Anybody know who the first director of the United States intelligence was? It was George Washington. Revolutionary War. He had all kinds of spies working. He had women, children, slaves. Everyone was working with intel. He did a great job as a spy master. I'm sure they used a bunch in the Civil War, but I don't have a lot of detail on that. The first U.S. intel department was the ONI, which was the Office of Naval Intelligence, which was founded in 1882. And the reason they did it was created in response to a brand new super weapon that was coming out in the world. It was called the battleship. So for the first time, foreign powers could credibly project power that threatened the United States. In 1880, the U.S. had the 12th largest Navy in the world, behind Brazil. So we were the second biggest in the Western Hemisphere. And so we created the Office of Naval Intelligence. Now, this is a Constitution class, and my question for everybody is naval intelligence constitutional? And it 100% is. We in the Constitution, we had a permanent Navy for a reason. It was to protect trade routes, and naval intelligence to basically enhance our ability to get weapons technology made a ton of sense. That was constitutional. And that was our intelligence agency from 1882 until World War I hits. World War I, we've got no ongoing active intelligence agencies. We still have the private agencies, the Dulles brothers, the Brown brothers, Harriman, all that stuff, the lawyers going out there and doing that stuff, but the U.S. government had no intelligence agency whatsoever. World War I hits, and we were very much behind in the area of intelligence, but we caught on quickly. John Gaeta, who was one of the high-ranking intel people in World War I for the United States, said, we were greenhorns, but we caught up. Our code breakers in World War I were fantastic. So the U.S. did very well with that. And it's important. There's going to be a theme here. I'm going to tell you all kinds of bad stuff about the U.S. intelligence and the CIA history and stuff like that, but there's some good parts to go with this as well. So this is not a black-white story. After the war, we took our eyes off the ball. So 1919, we just dropped all our intel agencies and just went about our merry way. The government stopped being informed about what foreign, basically the Secretary of State was doing all this work. As we've already mentioned, the State Department has been manipulated by a bunch of small families all intermarried together. For about a 40-year period, about 80% of the secretaries of state were related to each other, from Lansing and others. I've been through that one before. So we get to World War II. No intelligence services in place other than the ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence. So we've got to play catch up really quick. We're at like 1941. FDR had been running our intelligence agencies out of a desk drawer. That's not going to be very effective. Remember, the British have centuries of intelligence. I mean, these guys are good at this. They have their MI6, they got their MI5, they got stuff we've probably never heard of. They've been doing private intel and stuff like that. The English are very good at this. The Germans, they had their spies as well. We were playing catch up at the beginning of World War II. So we hire a guy by the name of Wild Bill Donovan. Wild Bill Donovan is a lawyer out of New York, a Republican lawyer. He comes out, man, they were ticked off when he got hired. The FBI and the military were furious about that. They did not like this guy. In the 1930s and 40s in New York City, it was about as corrupt as anything you've ever seen. And a lot of it they had blackmail on each other. The mafia was involved, the Democratic machine was involved. The Republicans who rose to power were just as corrupt. They all had dirt on each other. A lot of it had to do with sexual proclivities. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. Well, here comes Wild Bill Donovan. He's basically just rocking the boat. He comes in there and he's going to create an intel. You can see he was a World War I hero. And when he got in there, the concept called fraternal hostility was born. And I was going to name this presentation Fraternal Hostility, but not something that's a real catchy name. Basically, we're on the same team, but we hate each other's guts. It's the interagency, interdepartment rivalry and stuff like that. We see this today to this day. It's the same thing we saw when they created the DNI in 2005, the Director of National Intelligence. After 9/11, they basically decided to round all their different intel agencies into one, to report to one person. Oh man, that ruffles some feathers. Same type of thing. That's what Bill Donovan did. So people weren't happy about him. The OSS and the CIA. Here's a good thing that Donovan put in place. We were unique of all the world's intelligence agencies of putting analysis at the center of the intel process. Gather data, analyze it. We were very good at that from day one. It's one thing American intelligence did well. Donovan follows the British model of espionage, secret intelligence, and covert action. Covert action is a real key word here, because what does that mean? Well, it's one thing to gather intelligence and analyze it. Covert actions is pretty much everything just short of war. And that's what Donovan put in place. Influence through propaganda, sabotage, working with allies, working with indigenous resistance, and they brought in the James Bond-like tech gadgets. Donovan was a big fan of technology, so that's where that came from. So he creates what became the OSS, which is well, it was different than military intelligence. It was created for wartime only, intelligence gathering, and its whole job is to help us win the war. So enter the star of the show tonight, Alan Dulles. His background is interesting. So while he's working as a high-level functionary of the OSS, he still kept his corporate clients. Among them were a company called IG Farben. That's a German company. The saying back in the late 30s is Hitler is Farben, Farben is Hitler. So basically Adolf Hitler is Alan Dulles' client while he's a major player in the OSS trying to help us win a war against Hitler. Right. Sullivan and Cromwell, they would set up shell companies for IG Farben. German and American companies were linked through subsidiaries. You had Ford Motor Company, DuPont's were involved. Once again, we go back to the bank of Brown Brothers Harriman.
I have a question.
Yes.
So is it the same as Averill Harriman?
That is the same. That is the same exact same Harriman. In fact, this Harriman, the Averill Harriman that Holly mentioned, when he passed away, his son actually inherited the largest fortune in American history at the time. He was a member of Skull and Bones, real tight with Prescott Bush and all these people, all the Skull and Bones Yale people. So they're the exact same Harrimans. Prescott Bush worked for Brown Brothers Harriman. They were funneling, and when I talked about one of my earlier presentations, they were funneling money to the Nazis through Amsterdam and I forget the other. Might have been Antwerp, I might be correct. So yeah, that's who these people are. What else did Dulles do while he's working over there? Hey, Mark. What else did while he's working over there? Well, the interesting thing was the OSS is operating mostly out of London, and they have some people in Germany and different places. But he always wanted to be based in Bern, Switzerland, so he had no supervision. He's basically running his own gig, Alan Dulles. He kept secrets from the U.S. military that he had from the Germans. This guy by the name of Arthur Goldberg. Anybody remember that name?
Remember the name?
Yeah, he would go on to be sit on the Supreme Court, but he worked for Dulles in World War II. He, future SCOTUS, and he said Dulles should have been put on trial. He said that publicly, and it did not happen. Remember, I said the water was going to be an issue. Excuse me 1 second. So is everybody loving Alan Dulles at this point? Basically, he's running his own foreign policy. Toward the end of the war, they already had the Yalta Conference that was going to split up Europe, how it was going to be post-war. The Russians, the Soviets were going to have some, and the Western allies were going to have the rest, sort of what we ended up seeing after the Berlin Wall. Then they had the Casablanca Summit, which was a big one. And this is where the Americans assured the Soviets that there would be no conditional surrender. We are taking down Hitler, and all these people are going to face justice. We were not going to say, okay, we're going to let these guys off with a little pat on the hand. That was the agreement. Well, Dulles is doing the exact opposite. He wanted Germany more than anything to be a bulwark against the Soviet menace. One thing that I will tell you about this whole cabal of these Eastern blue bloods that were behind Brown Brothers, Herman, Sullivan, and Cromwell, the Dulles brothers, is they hated communism. They were anti-communist like you wouldn't believe. That was their fight. They're the ones that stirred up the entire McCarthy stuff, and which was funny because Dulles is the one who ended up taking down McCarthy, a decade later. But that's not tonight's show. Dulles is cutting deals with the Nazis. There's a guy by the name of General Karl Wolf, who met with in Italy. Wolf's the guy who kept the trains running on time for camps. You guys all remember Schindler's List?
Mm-hmm.
That's modeled after Karl Wolf. When he was getting arrested towards the end of World War II by American forces, Dulles sends his people in there to intervene and quote unquote arrest him ahead of time. And Karl Wolf ended up with a really sweetheart deal. I think he ended up finishing up his days in Argentina. And a lot of these Nazis got airlifted, which we'll get to in a second. Another great Nazi he worked with, this guy by the name of Reinhard Gehlen. And that's a name those who have paid attention should remember. Dulles is meeting with this guy in the middle of the war, and he's whining and dining him like they're in Switzerland, they're having dinners. He wanted him to come on board the American side. He liked Reinhard Gehlen. He is Reinhard Gehlen after the war, and this Reinhard Gehlen was an SS, very high-ranking guy. He did a lot of very bad things in World War II. He ended up becoming the head of West Germany's intelligence agencies in the post-war era for about 20 years. That's what Dulles did for Reinhard Gehlen, who should have been on trial at the Nuremberg trials, but somehow that didn't happen. And this is what Dulles is doing the entire time. And working for Gehlen was a guy by the name of Theodore Shackley. And remember that name because we're going to come back to him later. He is a very fun guy to talk about. He was basically his lieutenant. So he was exfiltrating Nazis, embezzling money, stopped the Nuremberg prosecutions. Pope Pius XII, the Catholic Church, is involved in this. Once the Nazis know that they're going to, the writings on the wall, they're going to lose the war. They start doing everything they can to basically make plans for the rise of the Fourth Reich. And a lot of that's airlifting them to Argentina and other places in South America, Chile, and a lot of it's getting a lot of money over there. The Vatican was very much responsible. There's a book called God's Banker by Gerald Posner that talks about this. Basically, they embezzled about $1 billion to Argentina. About half of that money went to Poland for the Solidarity movement, which is an anti-communist movement in Poland that did all kinds of fun stuff for about 20 or 30 years. And that came from the Vatican, Poland being a very Catholic country and all that. But the Catholic Church was very much involved with the Nazis in making this stuff happen. Highly recommend reading God's Banker or watching some videos on it. Money is a big part of the CIA. One of the ways we hold our intelligence agencies accountable is the power of the purse. They became a self-funding mechanism after World War II. We talked previously about the Anderson Trust, and I'll give you a little reminder. In the Pacific Theater, the Japanese had gathered up a lot of gold, gems, and stuff like that. And when they realized after losing the Battle of Midway, the Japanese knew the war was going to be over as a matter of time. So they started burying all this treasure in the Philippines in these 150 holes. U.S. military intelligence or the OSS captured a chauffeur of one of the Japanese generals, and they found the location of a bunch of these, and they basically found about $1.2 trillion back in those days worth of gold and stuff like that. Now, it's such a big deal. MacArthur gets on a plane and flies directly back to meet with, at the time it was Truman. And there are three guys that were there, was Lovett, Anderson, and the other name will come up here in a second, because I'm forgetting it right now. These guys became the custodians of what's called the Anderson Trust. This is money that wasn't repatriated back to America. It was used to funnel dark operations for the next several decades, the Anderson Trust. They had the Vatican money, they had that money. We'll get to in a second here, but they also had all the the opium money was coming through. So basically our intelligence agencies that are running amok, without any kind of sponsor or oversight, is a self-funding mechanism. So we basically had no oversight over a big part of our intelligence agencies. McCloy's the other guy's name. Interesting thing on the Anderson Trust of the third guy. Lovett was interesting because I talked about before, he was actually both him and his father were Skull and Bones members from Yale, and so that all these connections. It's a small little family of people that are running all these intelligences. Well, McCloy ends up being the Governor General of Germany, of West Germany, as we're trying to get them back on after World War II. So he's on the Anderson Trust, which is dark money being funneled to the CIA, yet he's running Germany and making sure that the wrong people don't get sent to the Nuremberg trials. This is how this is happening. So what's going on over in the Asian theater at the time? The OSS and the military are supporting Chiang Kai-shek in China. This is the Republican Nationals. Well, Chiang Kai-shek had made an alliance with a Chinese opium smuggling group. The biggest gang there is called the Green Gang. This is through the 30s and 40s. They're basically the opium dealers of the world. And they're in bed with Chiang Kai-shek, who's in bed with US military and the OSS. It's a nice, happy family. When Truman pulled the support for that, Chiang Kai-shek started losing the war very quickly. He did not send a shipment of arms that was supposed to go there. Mao Zedong and the communists ended up routing them and chasing them off to Taiwan. The opium trade was dead. So what did they do? They just moved the opium trade to Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Afghanistan. And we've seen what that's done over the last 5 decades. The OSS would follow the opium trade. So now, did I get the right page? Yes. I'm going to reintroduce you to a guy by the name of William Pauly. He's a very important name in this stuff over the decades. This is a wealthy guy. He had sugar plantations in Cuba. He had some friends in some low places. He was friends with an awful lot of dictators around the world. And sometimes he made a lot of money and sometimes he got completely blown out. I mentioned him when I talked about the Bush and Clinton crime families because William Pauly was one of the guys providing the aviation during the Iran-Contra as we're sending weapons down to Nicaragua. That was his airplanes. That's the same William Pauly 30 years later. He was really good friends with the Dulles brothers. He was good friends with Nixon. He's really good friends with Henry Luce. And I've talked about this before. Henry Luce is another member of Skull and Bones, Yale University, but he also was the founder of Time magazine, Life magazine, the ones who featured Adolf Hitler on the cover 8 times in a 7-year period. And he also was a founder of Sports Illustrated, but as a side note. So Henry Luce is involved. These are all the same people. It's a very small group of people. Give me 1 second, my eyes are watering. I got an eye infection, so it's getting kind of hard to read. So bear with me. Should have done this in bigger font, then we would have had 20 pages of notes. He was providing planes to intervene in China versus Japan prior to Pearl Harbor, from like 1931 to 39. This multimillionaire from America is intervening in foreign policy. These guys are pretty audacious. He was also very good friends with Batista, the Cuban dictator that Castro overthrew, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So the war ends, and by statute, the OSS has to be terminated. That it was created under an emergency situation, and it needs, once the emergency is over, you have to close it down. And it actually did close down about 3 months later. So the OSS at the time was a global operation. They were all over the world except for Latin America. The reason the OSS was not in Latin America is because the FBI had domain there. And basically, you got 14,000 intel operatives who've been running on full cylinder for about 5 years, all of a sudden out of a job. Or were they? At the same time, the Army goes from 16 million people to 1 million people. 15 million GIs come home. We get the GI Bill. We get the baby boom, and America sprouts. It's, just booms economically. We're the only country untouched by the war. So right towards the end of the war, 1944 presidential election, everybody knew that FDR was not going to make it through his next term. And the Democratic Party had a dilemma, had a decision to make. Who are they going to put in as their next vice president? Had they gotten a Northeasterner, it would have really upset the Southern Democrats. And if you put a Southern Democrat, you would have upset the Northeastern Democrats. So they had to, and it was a no-brainer that FDR was going to win election during the war. So they did a compromise guy, Truman, who was didn't have a really spectacular path. He's from Missouri. Wasn't threatening or anything like that, but that's how Truman became both vice president and then president. And when FDR passed away less than a year later, Truman became president, and he was green. I mean, he had no experience, no international experience, and he was thrown on the world stage. And he did a decent job considering his lack of, experience. Immediately, he flies over to Malta and has to sit there face to face with Churchill and Stalin. He got thrown into the fire pretty quickly. He also had to make the decision of whether to drop the atom bomb or not. And so Truman did not have an easy road. They came up with the Truman Doctrine, and basically they said that no European communism, even if the people chose it. So they were anti-communist. That was what Truman drew the line in the sand. Our side of the Berlin Wall was never going to be communist. So how are you going to make that happen? Well, that's what we're about to get into. He surrounded himself in 1945 with what was called the Missouri Gang. 5 of the 6 people in the name were all from Missouri. And some of them had some credentials, and some of them just happened to be from Missouri, so we trusted them. There's a military chief of staff, Admiral Leahy. There's the first DCI, which is Director of Central Intelligence, Sidney Sowers, who used to own grocery stores. The second DCI is a guy by the name of Hoyt Vandenberg, and there's nothing really special to say about him. There was Clark Clifford, who was a White House lawyer. There was Larry Houston, who was the general counsel for the OSS and later the CIA. Houston's an interesting player. We're not going to go into depth on him, but he was involved in a lot of interesting early parts of these intelligence agencies. But the name you want to remember, the 6th one, is a guy by the name of Roscoe Hillenkoetter. I told you there's some good things about the CIA and some not so good things. Roscoe Hillenkoetter is one of the good things about intel agencies. He ended up being actually the first director of the CIA, although technically Alan Dulles gets that credit. Hillenkoetter was first. He never wanted the job. He's an Annapolis grad. He was a linguist, which is how he got into intelligence in the first place as a Navy guy. He excelled as a military attaché in World War I. He had the most intel experience of any of the founders of it, which was called the Central Intelligence Group, CIG, before it became the CIA. And he left the fewest footprints. There's a reason nobody's really heard of him. The guy was quiet. He just did his job. He was in Paris when the Nazis marched in. He was stationed over there, and he stuck around to talk with other attachés to find out. And he's talking to these Nazi military attachés, and he's saying, "So, what are you guys going to, how are you going to invade England?" The German military actually says, "We can do that in 6 weeks." So apparently, they didn't get the information right, but. So anyways, after Germany, he gets transferred back to the Pacific Fleet, and his ship, he was on in a place called Pearl Harbor, and he was the last surviving ranking officer when their ship was sunk in the Pearl Harbor attack. This guy's like Forrest Gump. He keeps showing up in some interesting places. He ended up becoming the chief of Admiral Nimitz Understaffed Intel Center during World War II. So he's the perfect choice to step into an intel role, even though he didn't want it. 1945-46, something called the Doolittle Commission happens. Remember William Pauly? Yeah, he's on that commission. It's the guy who's been running private, intel operations in Asia. So he's on the Doolittle Commission, which was only uncovered or declassified like 30 years later. Doolittle was an executive VP of Shell Oil. He was also a decorated pilot in Japan. And the Doolittle report was mapping out our strategy for intelligence going forward. And I'm going to give you some quotes from the Doolittle report because it's important. "We will establish a covert psychological, political, and paramilitary organization that will be more ruthless than our opponents. Nobody should be permitted to stand in the way of the prompt, efficient accomplishment of our mission. It is now clear that we are facing an implacable enemy," they're talking about communists, "whose avowed objective is world domination by whatever means or cost. There can be no rules in such a game." They're basically drawing out that we are now going to no longer play fair. "If the U.S. is to survive, longstanding American concepts of fair play must be reconsidered. We must develop an effective organization that will learn to subvert, sabotage, and destroy our enemies by any means necessary. It may become necessary that our American people be made acquainted with and come to understand and support this fundamentally repugnant philosophy. They knew what they were doing is wrong. They're going to do it anyways because win at all costs by any means necessary. Hitherto acceptable norms of human conduct must not apply. These are the rules of the road that our intelligence agencies are given to. That's what the Doolittle report was talking about. Pauly would argue over the next 2 years for Dulles to become the permanent head of the CIA. So it's sort of like Hoover was permanent at the FBI. That's what these people wanted for Alan Dulles. Thank God that did not happen. There's another player in this guy by the name of George Kennan. He wrote what's called the Long Telegram. There's a piece that was basically giving his opinion of what the intel agency should be. It contributed to the Truman Doctrine. He questioned the wisdom of conciliation and appeasement with the USSR. He wanted the State Department to run the new department. Now, that sounds like, okay, that's better than the CIA running itself, but who was in charge of the State Department in 1946-47. No, that would have been John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles' brother. So Allen Dulles would have gotten the job anyways.
How cozy.
Yeah. He drafted a directive to establish a director to oversee this new war. He feared communism. Czechoslovakia just fell to communists. They were very concerned that Italy's communists, and they were going to do everything they could to stop that. Now, this is happening in Washington, D.C., and everyone's talking about how we're going to fight this from 45 to 47. In the meantime, Allen Dulles has never stopped operating in Europe in the OSS. He's already working behind the scenes without any kind of official sanction. So they're already subverting communist causes in Europe, despite the fact that they had no sanction to do that. He called it the logical application of the Clausewitz doctrine in the time of peace. Clausewitz was a famous German general, had all kinds of, it's like Sun Tzu, the art of war. He had a lot of military doctrine. Political warfare is the employment of all of the means in a nation's command, short of war, to achieve its national objectives. The U.S. could no longer draw an unmistakably line between war and peace. A little bit contradictory. Covert action was any action that did not precipitate direct military action. That's what Keenan was working for. It appears that the Pauli faction won out. They initially, when they created this CIG, they gave power to a State Department named group, but they realized that the limits they put on the CIA and had to be merged with the CIG, and ended up the CIA ended up being the one that got the power. So remember I mentioned Theodore Shackley, who was basically the lieutenant for a guy by the name of Gerhard, I just forgot his name. One of the guys that Dulles said, one of the German generals that he recruited. So Shackley is a piece of work. He's one of the stars of the show tonight. He served under Reinhard Gehlen at Fort Hunt. After the war, basically Dulles recruits him. And this German SS officer was in the entry class of the CIA in 1947 at the fish farm in Virginia. He's one of our very first recruits in the CIA. So then he goes back to Germany and he starts, he's one of the first people in the Anti-Communist Special Warfare Academy. These people are working behind enemy lines, trying to defeat communism. They're pretty effective at it. Anti-communist covert actions, they were trying to impact elections, and they were doing assassinations. That's what Shackley was all about. He was leading this. He would then become the CIA station chief in Miami in 1961. Why is that important? Because that's where the Bay of Pigs was launched from. He'd end up in the later 60s and the early 70s in Laos and Saigon, which is opium, the CIA covert war and the opium trade. He was the creator of the Phoenix program, which is the assassination program the CIA put in action in the 60s and 70s, which murdered over 100,000, maybe 200,000 civilians, which was all funded by opium money. He ordered the assassination. Here's a fun story of an Indonesian prince, Sihanouk, because of the mistress. Sihanouk had a mistress who also slept with a Viet Cong general. So Shackley decides to order his murder, which is fine, but he also had Sihanouk's best friend pull the trigger. They sunk him in a lake, and the friend felt bad and ended up confessing to General Creighton Abrams, who's the Army general. And that's how the story got public. Abrams ended up going ballistic and ordered the arrest of the CIA hit team. Because you can't be, murdering a prince of one of our allies. That makes sense. So Nixon intervenes. He reaches out to the House Judiciary Chair Peter Rodino, and 5 congressmen who represented the states for all of the hit team members actually got them all pardoned. So we were committing assassinations on allies under royalty, and all of our guys in the CIA got pardoned thanks to Nixon and the Congress. Shackley was then the head of covert operations under Bush from 1975 to 77, GHWB. They were running Contras, airlifts in contradiction to Congress in 75 to 77. We weren't allowed to do that. Fun story of a guy by the name of Joseph Burkholder Smith. This is one of the good guys. He was one of the CIA chiefs in Mexico City when Shackley got pulled out of Southeast Asia in 73 after the assassination. So Shackley gets there, he pulls all the station chiefs out, gets them all fired, and puts his own people in place, with his own handpicked men. But what Joseph Burkholder Smith tells us, he was number 2 at the station in Mexico City, and he gets a knock on his door, and they said, we're going to decide whether you're going to keep your job or not. This isn't the CIA talking to him. This is a guy by the name of Miguel Nazar Haro, who was DFS. That's Mexican CIA, FBI combined. He's deciding whether this CIA guy is going to keep his job. Says, do you want to talk to somebody? Sure, I'll talk to somebody. They end up getting in an airplane and flying down to Argentina. The guy gets out and it looks like, he goes, I get out of this plane, this private plane, and I feel like I'm in a Bavarian village. It's all German. And he goes and talks to somebody, and there's swastika flags, everything like that. And they tell him, here's what we're going to do. And he goes, and Smith ends up saying, I don't know who told you that I'd go along with this, but I'm not going to. And they got out of there alive. But this is basically where the whole plan was the cocaine cartel, and all the profits were to be used to fund what's quote unquote the war without boundaries. And this is where the cocaine cowboys came. This is where the entire American cocaine trade came from, was this whole operation. It's amazing that these ex-Nazi cocaine lords, etc., were determining who would be able to remain on station in Mexico City for the US CIA. That's how badly they were corrupted already in the 70s. And this led directly into the Iran-Contra scandal, which has never been adequately addressed. Oliver North was absolutely a key component of that. He's on Fox News and all the other CNN, MSNBC giving testimony, every week. He's honored, which is amazing. So what else did CIA do at the time? And I wish Angelique was here because she would have fun with this one. We actually tried to stage a coup of Charles de Gaulle in France. The CIA had tried to help the OAS overthrow de Gaulle. OAS is the Organisation Armée Secrète, basically a bunch of anti-de Gaulle rebels. What they cared about was Algerian independence. De Gaulle was the Algerians have been fighting for independence against France for quite some time. De Gaulle was trying to appease them and maybe work out, a peaceful resolution. These people said, heck no, we're not giving up one inch of what they considered French soil. And they were subversive and violent. They were a paramilitary terrorist organization since 1961. And that's when this all went down, the attempted coup of de Gaulle. Literally, the French were expecting paratroops in the air and tanks on the ground. That's how serious it was. So de Gaulle gets on the phone with JFK, who's the president at the time. He says, what the heck? Why is the US trying to back a coup? We're supposed to be your allies. Now, understand de Gaulle was a little bit independent. He was trying to be independent of NATO, even though they were members of it. So JFK gets on the phone and he goes, no, I had nothing to do with the coup, but I can't speak for my own CIA. Think about that.
Wow.
So now we've got the bad blood boiling between Dulles and the Kennedys. It's getting up there. After coming home from JFK's funeral 2 years later, after JFK was assassinated, de Gaulle says publicly, he goes, Kennedy was killed by the same security forces who went after me. He knew what was going on. On 8/22/1962, it's called the Day of the Jackal assassination. You've read all his books, Day of the Jackal, you've seen the movies?
Yeah.
That was about them trying to assassinate de Gaulle. Now, he survived because his security forces were very loyal to him. But that's what that was all about. That all happened. That was our CIA. Also in the 1960s, we have the famous Bay of Pigs invasion. So a little background of that is what's called Operation Condor, which was based out of Mexico City. Pemex is a giant oil company that was involved in all this. It was owned by a guy by the name of Jorge Diaz Serrano. He had been partners with George H.W. Bush and Zapata Oil Corporation a decade earlier, so he's connected. They're doing heroin smuggling operation out of the Golden Triangle, which we talked about. That's Laos, Cambodia, everything. And it's involved with the Corsican Mafia, which of course is Lucky Luciano. And if you remember the presentation I gave earlier, Lucky Luciano was freed by Dewey so he could help with Operation Underworld to help the Mafia help the military patrol the New York docks, and they helped the U.S. military and the invasion of Sicily when we brought our military over from Africa. So luckily, the Mafia is involved with the military intelligence and the CIA, and that's all part of this. So they're smuggling the heroin into Cuba, which is distribution center. So when Castro takes over Cuba, the CIA is furious. The Mafia is furious. And all these other people that are benefiting, guys like Hawley and everyone like that, they're furious. They want Castro gone. They want Cuba back. And that's a major part of the next chapter of the story. A guy by the name of Santos Traficante was partners with Batista. Santos Trafficante was a mafia guy, and he was the one directing all the flow of drugs, heroin, opium during the heroin ship to the United States. That's Santos Trafficante, and he's a book of himself. He's a very interesting character. There's a company called the Southeast Asia Supply Company, run by a guy named Paul Hollywell. He's another one of these connected guys. He was also implicated in the savings and loan scandal along with the Bushes. Hollywell, well, you see all these different corporations, and they're using all these offshore banks. And I'm not going to go too deep into this because that's the next chapter in this when I start talking about the Epstein networks. But Hollywell's name will come up again, and how that all ties into the 21st century. Another corporation was called International Business Corporation, which is owned by none other than William D. Pauly. Same names keep popping up. IBC would purchase the weapons for the Contras. You heard of the Flying Tigers. That's Pauly's air fleet. These are the people that are shipping everything out. You know, all the planes were coming into Mena, Arkansas, where when Bill Clinton was governor. That's the Flying Tigers. Same people. And the CIA and the Mafia wanted Cuba back. Bobby Kennedy is furious when he finds out that the CIA is working with the Mafia to take out Castro, because he spent the better part of 5 years trying to take down the Mafia. And so Bobby Kennedy's not happy. So now you got the Department of Justice at war with the CIA. We'll see who wins that. So the Bay of Pigs happens. And really what happened was Dulles didn't stack the invasion. Basically a bunch of sea-level CIA and cannon fodder Cubans. He expected that part of it to fail. What he thought would happen is he'd be able to force Kennedy into sending the military. That was plan B. Kennedy didn't do it. And now the feud is on. I mean, these people hate each other's guts. Well, Kennedy ends up firing Dulles after the Bay of Pigs. And there are some people who think that's why Kennedy got assassinated. And I'm not going to disagree. Now, I think that was probably the, it wasn't
Like the last straw kind of thing.
It wasn't because he wanted to end the Federal Reserve or anything like. I think it's because he crossed Allen Dulles one too many times. So he gets fired, but Dulles doesn't get the memo. He keeps acting like he's running the CIA. All of his aides keep running over to his house, wherever in Bethesda, Maryland, or something like that, and updating him. He starts making the rounds, Dulles, and even though he's fired, and starts speaking out against Kennedy. He basically set up an anti-Kennedy government in exile. The new director of the CIA is a guy named John McCone. He's nothing but a puppet head, and he's anti-Kennedy. So JFK gets assassinated in November of 1963. So who was behind that? Was it Lee Harvey Oswald?
No.
Oh, you don't. That's the official story.
No.
So who was in Dallas at that period of time? Well, Allen Dulles spent a lot of time in Dallas in October of 1963. He was there. We've got the records. Allen Dulles had an international kill team, his assassination squad. I'm going to go through their members here. They all were brought back to Dallas for the sole purpose of killing JFK. That's my thesis here. The first name you need to know, and you've heard this name before, is E. Howard Hunt. He admitted to this to his children on his deathbed 20 or 30 years later. So take that for what it's worth. He was the CIA leader at the Bay of Pigs. That was E. Howard Hunt. He later became famous because he was the guy who led the break-in team at Watergate Hotel that got Nixon canned. That's E. Howard Hunt. So he was on that team. He was in Dallas in November of 1963 when Kennedy was shot. Another guy by the name of David Morales was in Dallas. He was the Miami station chief. We mentioned Miami before. Shackley. That's where we're doing Bay of Pigs out of. Well, that's David Morales. He would later go on to Laos and Vietnam and work in that theater of the opium smuggling and other interesting activities. Another fun one is a guy by the name of David Phillips who actually met with Oswald. He was a failed actor and newspaper publisher in Santiago, Chile. He was recruited by the CIA in the 1950s. In 1955, he wins a Distinguished Intelligence Medal for deceptive broadcasts in the CIA overthrow of the Chilean government. Color Revolution, anybody? They've been doing this for a long time. In fact, by some people's calculations, our CIA has overthrown over 80 different countries in the last 60 or 70 years, including most recently, in my opinion, Brazil, and before that, the United States of America. I can't prove that, so I won't say it, even though I did. He also worked with E. Howard Hunt on propaganda for the Bay of Pigs. He was stationed in Mexico City. He was informed within days when Oswald contacted the Cuban embassy on September 27th, 1963. So he knew that Oswald was talking to the Cubans. That's how they were able to pick Oswald as the patsy. At least that's the theory I'm working with here. A guy by the name of Antonio Vespasiano was an ex-Cuban, very high guy in the Castro government who ended up defecting to the United States. He was working with the CIA in 1963. He claims to have seen Phillips and Oswald together in Dallas. That's a pretty good testimony. Under oath and under some of these commissions. 1998 National Security Archive produced documents that showed Phillips, at the direction of CIA Director Richard Helms and President Nixon, worked with Chilean right-wing elements to assassinate General Rene Schneider in 1970. So he was definitely part of the assassination squad. That's documented. Who else is there? A guy by the name of William Harvey. Remember these names. I'm going to get back to them in a second. He was the head of assassination. He was in Dallas. Harvey's a piece of work. He had to leave the United States after the Bay of Pigs to escape Bobby Kennedy's wrath. So he went over to was it Italy? I think so. Because he was basically sent in a raiding team to Cuba that would have started World War III. So Bobby Kennedy's not real happy with him. He admitted they were recruiting mafia people in Italy to kill communist leaders. That's what he went to go do. You know, I'm not a big fan of communists and stuff like that, but we're really not supposed to be in the assassination game. A guy by the name of Mark Wyatt, who was Harvey's deputy, realizes Harvey is dangerous. He's arguing with him about this stuff and over the assassinations in Italy. This Wyatt's over there, and Harvey pulls a gun on him, on his own deputy, and this is under Wyatt's own testimony. The guy pulled a gun on me to shut me up. So the guy's a bit of a wild card. He's the head of the assassination team. And Wyatt was on a plane with Harvey from Rome to Dallas, Texas in November of 1963. So we have Harvey documented in Dallas when Kennedy was shot. Dulles spent 2 days, when Kennedy gets shot. So Dulles is living in his, whatever, his home somewhere in the suburbs of DC, but the 2 days, the one day before and a couple days after Kennedy's shot, Alan Dulles spent 2 days at the farm. The farm, that's the CIA headquarters outside in Northern Virginia, called Camp Pierre. At the time of the assassination, he's hanging out there in his communications center, even though he doesn't have a job, doesn't work for the CIA. They'd had a house built for Dulles there. It was called an alternative command post. They used the farm as a training center, interrogation center, assassination training center. That's a CIA fish farm or the farm. And Dulles is hanging out there while Kennedy's being assassinated. So you can draw your own conclusions. I know what I think. So Kennedy gets assassinated, and we have to investigate it, of course. So we got the Warren Commission put together to investigate it. So who's on this Warren Commission? Who's going to investigate the assassination of the U.S. president? Well, you got Earl Warren, the Chief Justice. That may make sense. That's why they call it the Warren Commission. They had a couple senators, Richard Russell and John Sherman Cooper. Nothing special about that. A couple congressmen, Hale Boggs, and the other congressman's a guy by the name of Gerald Ford, who'd later become president of the United States. Then there's a guy by the name of John McCloy. And who's John McCloy? And what's he doing on this? Well, he's the president of the World Bank. Kind of makes you scratch your head. What's he doing on the Warren Commission? And the last guy on there, the seventh guy, was a guy by the name of Alan Dulles, who was in charge of investigating the assassination that he may have actually ordered. So the conclusions from the Warren yes, Holly.
So how were these people chosen to be on this committee?
How indeed? How were they chosen? I would assume LBJ's staff did it. LBJ put together the commission, and they said, okay, these are the people we're going to have lead it. The idea was basically to, convince the American people we're going to look into our president. None of this stuff was public information at the time. People had no idea. I mean, we were being told that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman, and that Jack Ruby, the mafia hitman, killed him. But that's all the information we had at the time. The world was in shock. The country was in shock. For those of you who, there's a few people here that may have remembered it. Almost. Yeah, my parents were old enough, and my mom tells me about this. She's been telling me about her whole life. It was a pretty devastating day. It was a lot more shocking than I think than 9/11. The day the music died, right? Who else was on there? The top investigator was a guy by the name of James Jesus Angleton, who I've mentioned before. Angleton happened to be a member of Skull and Bones. He was also a Dulles lieutenant. When Dulles dies in 1969, Angleton's the guy who immediately flies into his home and swoops in and confiscates and burns all of Dulles's notes. That's Angleton for you. So there were 7 file names that the CIA, quote unquote, still keeps secret from all that investigation. And I bring this up because, well, I could listen. In 1992, there's a congressional act that basically was about revealing all the JFK files. And they said in the next 25 years, all this information needs to be public. So that brings us to 2017. Trump's president, and the vast majority of the CIA files became public, but some of it was held back. And most of that became public in 21 and 22, like in the last 2 years. And I've done all of these files. You can find this information there. I've got the website. It's there. 7 key files were still held back. Files about people. And I'm going to read the names of these people. You're going to remember these. I just talked about these people. Well, William Harvey's file was kept back. Remember? Harvey, who's part of the assassination team. So was David Phillips, another member of that assassination team in Dallas. A woman by the name of Ann Goodpasture had her files kept. Who's Ann Goodpasture? She was a top aide to Win Scott, who was the Mexico City station chief. She originally denied and then confessed to transcribing the Lee Harvey Oswald calls prior to the assassination. These are the calls he's making to the Cuban embassy, and apparently to supposedly Soviet handlers and stuff like that. They knew what Oswald was talking about, and they knew that he wasn't plotting to kill Kennedy. But whether he was or not, they knew this. She transcribed it, tried to deny it, and then admitted it. Those files were kept hidden because that would have given up the entire lone gunman narrative. Guy by the name of Yuri Nosenko, his files were kept hidden. Who's Yuri? Well, he was a KGB defector in 1964, a high-level KGB guy. He had actually seen the KGB files of Lee Harvey Oswald when he was in Russia, and he said the KGB did not recruit Oswald. Period. They weren't interested. The guy's a nobody. Now, that could be disinformation. It could not have been. It's the KGB. It could be double agents. So take it with a grain of salt. But there's a reason the CIA kept that and still keeps a lot of that redacted. Next name that was held back was E. Howard Hunt, our good friend, Mr. Watergate and Mr. Assassin. We already talked about David Sanchez Morales. His was held back too. And the last one is a guy by the name of George Joannidis. It's a tough name. So he worked for Morales at the Miami station, CIA. His title was the Chief of Psychological Warfare Operations. Interesting. He ran what's called the Cuban Student Directorate. These were anti-Castro Cubans, kids. It's an anti-Castro group that tangled with pro-Castro. Oh, and this group, the student group, was actually in a street brawl with Oswald and his buddies the summer before, in the summer of 1963. Boy, this went faster than I thought. We're going to have time for questions. So the conclusion, and I'm going to give you a quote from a book called The Old Boys. That's a really good book about the origins of the CIA by a guy named Burton Hirsch. The Old Boys. He says, how did we choose to entrust our information gathering and assessment competencies, to say nothing of subversion and action programs, action in quotes, to a civilian, i.e. a commercially and politically, rather than a military-driven system? Whom in an open society does a secret service serve? Just when did the meaning of the word intelligence pass beyond the accumulation and interpretation of strategically useful detail and begin to reference a thicker and thicker playbook of technologies for manipulating and strong-arming neighboring societies? These are good questions, and that's what happened. And now this whole thing's been turned against us here in America. So that's where we're at. We have a rogue intelligence agency that is not being held accountable by Congress. They are self-funding. They have their own goals. They set their own foreign policy. If you believe some of the things that we've seen lately, they may determine who's the president of the United States.
Yeah, well, and then along with the FBI's been on it too.
Yeah, that's another presentation. The FBI is another presentation for another day. Hoover, and I'll get into that because Hoover was so compromised by his lifestyle, homosexual lifestyle, cross-dressing. The mafia had dirt on him. Everyone had dirt on each other. But that's my next presentation. I'm not going to give that all away.
But it's still, I mean, it seems like it's still happening today.
Well, it is. I mean, when do you recall ever once these intelligence agencies being held accountable and saying you got to change your ways? No, they just pass it down to the next generation. And we're talking about thousands and thousands of people employed around the world that are accountable to nobody. And who's setting their foreign policy? It's these same corporate interests, these blue bloods, these multinational corporations, the elites, whatever you want to call them.
The sociopaths.
Well, they are. Quite a few of them are sociopaths. Who runs the world? Or the people, almost every war we've gotten in, we've been lied into. The same people own the press. The media has been war hawks for every war. They start beating the war drums left and right as soon as there's a chance for war profiteering. You can talk about the military industrial complex, they're part of it, but there's others. Who else profits? We have United Fruit doing all, creating all the banana republics in Central America. That was done with private intelligence, but it's the same idea. Major General Smedley Butler, when he wrote his book, War is a Racket, he talks about that. He goes, I was a mercenary for corporate interests for 35 years. He's one of the most decorated Marines in history. And they tried to use him to stage a coup in the United States on FDR. And the only person who ever did a day in jail for that, or was ever prosecuted, was in 1941 when Prescott Bush got busted for trading with the Enemy Act after Nazi Germany had declared war on us. There's no accountability. These people are, you hear about too big to fail, too big to jail. You can't even accuse these people. They're all on CNN right now. All these ex-intelligence people. They told us, 51 intelligence agencies said that, Hunter Biden's laptop, it has all the signs of Russian disinformation. Really? Because we know that's bunk thanks to the Twitter files and some other investigative work. That's the world we live in. Who runs America? Who runs the world? It's these unnamed, unelected intelligence agencies, and they take their directions from who? People in smoky rooms, smoking their cigars. When I talk about the British intelligence, I think you can't really disconnect the British intelligence from American. The Anglo-American alliance.
Five Eyes.
Yeah, Five Eyes as well. The British Empire, the empire where the sun never sets. They were masterful at how to dominate and subjugate populations. Well, they were exhausted economically after World War II and World War I and World War II. And so they just turned over all the heavy lifting to the US. But do you think they stopped, being part of the decision-making process? You think their Council of 300, their round table, their secret societies that go hand in hand with our Council of Foreign Relations, which was set up by the Rockefellers and other blue blood families. This is how this stuff works. And our intelligence agencies are the ones carrying out a lot of this. And our military intelligence is now, it looks like, more and more working with them. It's been co-opted. There used to be a little bit of a struggle between the two. The military is very straight-laced, mission specific. I don't think that's the case so much anymore, at least in the upper brass. And it's frightening, and it should be. So with that, anybody have questions? Or are you so ticked off that you just want to go?
Yeah.
Let me see if there's any questions here in the Zoom real quick.
I have a question. How do I get a copy of tonight's presentation? The verbiage.
What's that?
How do I get a copy of the verbiage?
Of this?
Yeah.
I got to do is ask me. I'll email it to you.
Oh, great. Thanks.
No questions. We can say they can see me fine, at least. All right, very good. Any other questions? Because this went quicker than I expected. Anybody know what time it is?
Oh, I believe it's the same.
Okay, well, that's just about perfect. Nope.
Going, Brady. Yeah.
I was sick by elementary, so why was JFK hated? Why did they assassinate him?
Well, because he stopped the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Okay.
They wanted Cuba back, and he said, no, that's not going to happen. And his brother, Bobby Kennedy, was going after the mafia. Bobby was the Attorney General of the United States. And of course, Bobby would be assassinated 5 years later. Yes.
So what do you think of the theory that Nixon was taken down because he threatened to expose the fact that the CIA assassinated Kennedy?
Question is, the theory. What do I think about the theory that Nixon was taken down because he was going to expose the fact of the CIA?
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. It's a very good question. Why Nixon was taken down by intelligence agencies, and I would say you can draw that because E. Howard Hunt was involved. Nixon had just won a blowout election,
Landslide.
a landslide. He did not need to be spying on, was it George McGovern, or is that who was running this? He did not need to be spying, and he was taken down for something that was about 1/100th as bad as what our FBI did to Donald Trump in 2015 and 16. So why did they take out Nixon? This guy is a career CFR guy. Nixon, his entire administration were Council of Foreign Relations puppets, stuff like that. I don't know why they took out Nixon. I've been asking the same question, and I haven't come up with a good answer that's plausible yet. But he ticked off somebody, and might have had to do with the fact that he was being forced to pull out of Vietnam, because those two coincided quite a bit. And I was going to cut off the gravy train of the opium trade from the Golden Triangle in Asia. That may have had something to do with it. I don't know. We have not gotten a good answer for why. You know, Nixon didn't get taken down because of Watergate. He got taken down because of the cover up after Watergate, because he lied to the American people. God, I wish we had those same standards today.
Yeah.
So no, I don't know why they, but I do think the intel agencies openly plotted.
Had a hand in it, yeah.
Yeah. So who'd they put in place? You know, who almost became president? Nelson Rockefeller,
Oh,
who ran against Nixon in '68. But yeah, he didn't have enough political pull on that one. Yeah. Well, in fact, Nelson Rockefeller,
he
he
become
became vice president.
of Gerald Ford, right?
Yeah, Gerald Ford became president. You know, Gerald Ford, who sat on the Warren Commission, becomes president. Nelson Rockefeller becomes VP, but at that point, Nelson had no political viability and couldn't run for president. And that's how we got Jimmy Carter. And Carter was not connected at all. He was one of the most unconnected, innocent, babe in the woods politicians we've seen in our lifetimes. You know, he didn't have any of those connections.
Interesting.
He was just incompetent, or policies were awful. The people around him were incompetent, I should say. Pretty smart guy.
Yeah, I think he was just naive.
You touch one with the sharks if you haven't been in a pool before. It's, you know, DC is it's ugly, and that's in the 70s. Think about what it is like today. Any other questions?
So is this, all of this information, is it passed from president to president to president? I mean, the upper echelons of our political system privy to the history of
Yeah, that's a great question.
political history?
So for the Zoom, the question is, you know, all this information, all these quote unquote secrets, is each president, are they privy to it when they come into office? And I would say absolutely not.
I guess.
No, I don't think the CIA, you know, showed Donald Trump their dirty laundry when he got into office. I don't think that happens. I think they keep secrets.
Trump would have had to have known you.
You know, it's interesting. I don't even think the director of the CIA knows everything the CIA is doing. They're so compartmentalized. There's a lot of good, honest, patriotic Americans that work for the CIA and the FBI and military intelligence. They have no idea what the left hand is doing. They're doing their job. They keep this stuff very compartmentalized. It's organized, and the security is everything. But the black ops people, and they know everything. Well, even some of them don't know. You know, if you're working black ops in Laos, you have no idea what's going on in Cuba.
Yeah.
What I will tell you is all around the world, and all these military bases we have, we are flying drugs into military bases to get to America. That's been going on for decades. So the military is corrupt as far as that goes. Not all the military is corrupt. We all have friends and family are in the military. They're very honest, patriotic people. But somehow, you know, they don't have to go through customs. You know, you remember that you've seen in the movies, they fly drugs in with coffins out of Vietnam. Well, that's real. That happened. They got a lot of ways to smuggle stuff in here. And you know, that's how they fund their operations. You know, it's tax-free money. And this whole network of offshore, and I'll get into this with the next presentation, all the network of offshore banks. You're going to find, you know, blue chip multinational corporations banking at the same offshore banks as mafia people, Israeli Mossad people, CIA. They're all working for the same banks. And that ties into, you know, what we saw with the savings and loan scandal. It's all money laundering. This stuff's been going on at least since the 60s. And there's no accountability. There's no Congress. When was the last time you heard a congressperson stand up and say, we've got to do something about this? Not even Ron Paul would take these people on. Yeah. Now, he went after the Federal Reserve, and he's the only person I know who's done that and is still alive.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we got a bit of an issue that needs to be taken care of.
How do you take care of something like that? Then?
How do you take care of something like that?
I mean, that's, there you got all the money, you got all the connections.
And the power.
Transparency. You know, sunlight's the best disinfectant. You rip-
Cash Patel says you just stop, you take away their money for certain little projects.
Yeah, but they can fund themselves. They're self-funded with the drug trade. You can start by closing the border. Why do you think nobody wants open border? Why do you want open borders? You know, they're in bed with the cartels.
Mhm.
I don't even want to talk about the human trafficking part of it. But the CIA has been involved in narcotics and human trafficking, you know, since the 1950s. It's documented. I'm not making this stuff up. I'm gonna go up and pull you 100 documents that show these people have been caught doing this stuff. We've got testimony in Congress, in front of courts. You know, this happens. And well, the American people aren't outraged enough, and a lot of that has to do with the media. You know,
Hey guys, hey
operation-
Brady.
Yes,
Hey, so I wanted to, you guys were talking about human trafficking. You know,
Yeah.
I'm down in Texas, right? And
Yep.
this would have been golly, the 15th of January. And I was driving out of Dallas and I was just outside of Austin. I was on the north side of Austin with my sister. Kid you not. We pull into a grocery store, a big chain, and there is a bus that clearly was trafficking. I mean, and we saw the coyote and everything. The middle of the friggin' day. It was probably like 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a Sunday, and it was blatantly that they were trafficking young, militarized, aged men coming in. Police were around, didn't bother them. I mean, it was wild.
And half the people in the room were just nodding their heads, say, "Yeah, we've heard this too." You know, we're in San
I mean,
Diego.
like legitimately saw that shit with my own 2 eyes.
Yeah, it's really,
So-
you go out about 30, 40 miles east here in California. You know, somebody's got 30, 40 acres of woods and stuff like that. You've got cartel people, you know, growing marijuana and what have you on their own territory. We've got a, US, California Forestry Department has got a bunch of paramilitary guys doing gunfights with cartels here in California. And our government's not doing the federal government's not doing a darn thing about it. Yeah. So how do you fix it? Well, remember Operation Mockingbird? That's where the CIA, was basically infiltrating the media. Well, of course, that's gone for, every one of these John Brennan, James Clapper, they work for CNN or MSNBC now. Yeah, so the media's got to be fixed. We've got to get the full transparency has to happen. America's got to wake up to exactly who is running the country. Because it's not who you think it is. It's not who most people think it is. I know everyone here is a little bit more savvy, but what kind of truth is it going to take for people to realize they've been lied to? It's easier to tell someone a lie than it is to tell them they've been lied to.
Yeah.
It's hard. And that's why this is an information battle. It's it's an information war. It's a culture war. But the truth is the truth. And truth is the American government. We think of ourselves as the good guys as Americans, and we are as American citizens. We've got pretty good morals and values, but our government is not. They have not. I mean, they've overthrown over 80 foreign governments, and a lot of it's done for our corporate profits. And it's it doesn't make you proud. So does the rest of the world have a reason to be ticked off
Yeah,
at us
big time.
or our government?
Well, our government.
Well, we owe it to them to do something about it.
Yeah.
So are you saying that our presidents haven't known what the CIA?
Well, I think some of them have. I think George H.W. Bush certainly did.
Oh, yeah.
I think Obama certainly did.
Mm-hmm.
I think George W. Bush certainly did. Did Trump know a lot of this stuff? Yeah, he had his own private intelligence agency. He's one of the most well-informed people on the planet. Even he got caught, with his pants down on a few of these things. He had no idea how deep the swamp was. Does Joe Biden know this stuff? No, Joe Biden doesn't even know what room he's in. But his handlers sure do. And
Susan Rice.
yeah, well, Susan Rice is a work of art. And she's not even high ranking, stuff like that. The people, that really call the shots of the CIA, they've never, these are the smoke-filled room guys. These are the skull and bones. These are the patriarchs. And it's not just Americans. You've got you got all kinds of European oligarchs that are part of the same thing. Where it's interesting is, we always talk about the Great Reset. And I've been telling you for a while, the Great Reset has failed. There is, in the banking world, US banks have stopped accepting a lot of European paper for overnight repos. There's a split between the European banking system and the American banking system. As much as we hate the Federal Reserve, it is a lot more flexible than the European central banks are because they are government owned and ours are private owned. European banks are about one hiccup away from collapse. And those are the people that will take down the rest of the Great Reset, the EU, that whole Davos crowd. You know, the only question is how much damage will they do on their way out? But I do think you're going to see a split between America and Europe. You're going to see the Far East, you know, Russia, India, China. We're going to have a multipolar currency world, which I've talked about before. And America is going to, and Europe are going to have a real tough time because we've spent the last couple of decades switching over to expensive, inefficient green energy. Well, we're going to be competing on a level playing field with people that have cheap fossil fuels. I think we'll come out of it okay, but you know that's you know, this is a happy ending as opposed to the worst case scenarios, which involve balloons dropping EMPs. So we're hoping to avoid that sort of stuff. But the peaceful ending to this global Game of Thrones, which is really what it is. It's Game of Thrones on steroids. I forget the gentleman's name. Is another book I read recently. Talked about who really runs the world. He thinks, and this guy worked for Kissinger. And so he would know. Kissinger's still running U.S. policy in Ukraine. The guy's 98 years old. And Kissinger's a Rockefeller puppet, always has been. So is Brzezinski. So is Maurice Strong, who started the global warming movement, the Paris summit in Rio in 1992. And also Klaus Schwab was a Kissinger and puppet of the World Economic Forum. So who's making these decisions? Well, a lot of it goes to the Rockefellers, but they don't sit thrown alone. So this guy, and I'm sorry I forget his name, because I've got two of his books and I really ought to remember it. He estimates there's about 6,000 families around the world that are really, when Saudi princes, different magnates all over the world that are really playing this great Game of Thrones. And of those 6,000 families, there's probably about a dozen who sit at the big boy table. And we can name some of them we've never heard of. A lot of these are ancient bloodlines coming through Rome and Venice, all through Europe. I'm pretty sure the Dutch royals are involved, all the oil magnates, because they were Royal Dutch Shell. The British royals are certainly have a seat at the table. But can you take down 6,000 families all at once? Well, you can't, because there's 8 billion of us. And most of us, people are going to get sick and tired of it if the information gets out there. So maybe there's a happy
Our job.
Maybe there's a happy ending, maybe there's not, but what an interesting time to be alive.